Yeah, they did point now. I had worked for one for a year. That's how I met. Paul can be with what Fred, who graduated without any knowledge of that. You know, water is a key component of agriculture. Yeah. So how can you be graduating people in food economics, in agricultural economics? And so I hope that
yeah, they have them, of course, now, natural resource economics, but
well, that's what I would say.
yeah, it's not,
And that
the water is part of that.
yes,
but
yes.
they can offer.
So I had to scratch my head trying a geohydrology course that I could attend because environmental engineering department limited to their majors. Well, but I didn't do that because I knew the chair of the department. I could have gone and said, not knowing that.
Oh, yeah, there's always a way.
I didn't do that. Then I did some geology and well, anyway, he didn't really enjoy teaching, so we had a lot of good.
Sure, I'll get one. Oh, well, good. Thanks for coming. Testing. 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 Hi, yes, good. Nice to see you.
So glad you're here. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Nobody has called, so I'm gonna sit in the back and keep it up.
We're working on a plan to rescue our son. No. Oh dear. How old is he? What happened? Oh. Not something you expect to do when your kids are in their 40s.
You about ready to start, Bob? Let me do my spill first.
Good morning. Everybody, let's take a seat. For people on Zoom, you are muted. Please stay muted. At the end, during questions and answers, if you can please put in the chat your questions, I will be monitoring that. For those in the room, if you have a cell phone, if you can please silence it, it would be greatly appreciated. And Bob Vernstein is here, who's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to welcome Alan here. Alan Hodges is an agricultural economist emeritus at the University of Florida with IFAS, the Food and Resource Economics Department. Before retiring in 2019, after 34 years, He served as director of the UF Economic Impact and Analysis Program and in numerous leadership roles for UF IFA's Extension Education and Outreach Program. He has conducted research studies on a broad range of issues and industries, including agriculture, forestry, fisheries, environmental horticulture, bioenergy, healthcare, higher education, natural disasters, tourism, and recreation, which is quite a list and varied list. He received his master's and doctoral degree in agricultural and biological engineering from University of Florida and a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. He's a native of Iowa and now lives on a small farm in Alachua County with his wife Susan. And you may know his mother-in-law, Beth Swigowski, is a resident here at Okemah. So we welcome Alan back, and he has given talks before. And we have had talks about the value of salt marshes and seagrass and other things and trying to put a dollar value on how do you do that? He's the one that knows how, and he'll tell us.
Well, thank you, Bob, for the kind introduction. Delighted to be here. I did a lecture here a few years ago at Okemah, so it's great to be back. The topic, I think, is very interesting. This was not my specialty as an economist at UF, but something I dabbled in a little bit. I taught a part of a class at UF several years on this, and so I hope you find this interesting. Ecological economics is a fairly new discipline in the world of economics. It's been around since maybe about the 1960s, and it's led to really an explosion of research in this area and the intersection of economics and the environment, and it's obviously has a lot of relevance to many important issues today like global climate change, renewable energy, water resources, and biodiversity. So start with this picture that is sort of the conventional model of how economies work, the circular flow of dollars and goods and services here with households and business firms and markets exchanging goods and services here with dollars, goods and services flowing in one direction, and dollars, currency flowing in the opposite direction, with the measure of GDP here as the summary measure of overall activity in the economy. And this diagram suggests that the economy is a closed system, but I would argue that this is really not the way the world works. The economy is not a closed system. Obviously, there's important inputs from the environment that humans extract from the earth, and so this is really an incomplete picture of how the world works. With the rise of ecological economics in the last half century or so, we've come to understand that there's some important issues that were not being dealt with by the traditional neoclassical view of economics. One is that there's important constraints on economic activity, that the world has limited resources and we have to abide by those resource limitations. There's the idea of natural capital, that there are natural assets in the world that we draw on, and we need to treat those like businesses do with their assets, to account for those and measure those accurately. And then the idea of environmental ethics and intergenerational equity, that it's our responsibility to treat the world sustainably and leave the resources of the world for future generations to use. Also, the uncertainty of long-term outcomes. The fact that we really don't know that some of the economic activity going on today can lead to unforeseen outcomes in the future. And global climate change is a perfect example of that. And the irreversibility of environmental changes. The fact that consequences of our economic actions today will lead to changes that cannot be undone in the future. And again, climate change is a perfect example of that. It's really, the CO2 emissions that have been emitted since the industrial age are now really baked into the Earth's climate and cannot be undone easily. And then also an ethic about sustainable development, that we need to be sustainable in what we're doing. So one of the key leaders of the ecological economics movement is Herman Daly. And so a lot of what I'm going to present to you today is from the major textbook on ecological economics that he wrote some years ago. And this figure, I think, nicely depicts the change in thinking about the world that has come about from the field of ecological economics. The top part there, what he calls empty world, is where the economy here, nested in this larger circle that represents the world, is a relatively small part of that. And where the ecosystem services that contribute to human welfare are actually more important than the economic services. Think about primitive societies who are hunter-gatherers, who most of what they got was from the ecosystem, not from their trading relationships with other humans. Contrast that here with what he calls the full world, where the economy is a much bigger part of the whole system and is associated with much larger environmental discharges or pollution and economic services that contribute to human welfare, and where the ecosystem services now is diminished because of degradation and depletion of those resources. So this is, I think, a good example of where we're at today with the full world. And I mean, truly, we're facing a situation where the human population of the Earth is going to be, at some point, reach a maximum. We think now somewhere around 9 to 10 billion people. Currently, it's about 6.5 billion. But we're quickly approaching that point where probably exceeding the carrying capacity of the Earth for the human population. So what are we talking about with ecosystem services? This is the diagram that came from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a big project, World UN-sponsored project back around the turn of the century, to sort of catalog and codify the concepts of ecosystem services. So you see here on the left the four basic categories of ecosystem services: provisioning services that would include things like food, water, fuel, and so forth; regulating services, regulating the climate, regulating the water cycle, purifying water; cultural services, education, recreation, spiritual enjoyment; and supporting services like nutrient cycling, soil formation, and primary production of the plant and animal kingdom. And then on the right, you see these services are mapped onto the different constituents of human well-being: security, material for material livelihood, health, social relationships, and freedom of choice in action. So, and the strength of these relationships here is indicated by the thickness of those arrows. So I'll note that some of these services are marketed services provided through the economy, and others are non-marketed or indirect services. Some of these can be quantified pretty well. We have measures available for those. Others, not so much. There can be only roughly estimated. This is, I think, a nice view of the breakdown of the different types of economic values that economists recognize. So starting on the left here, the direct use value are probably the most obvious ones. These are the things that we use directly, many of them taken direct from the environment or arise from the cultural activity and economic services. Then indirect use value, resources that are used indirectly, and that includes things like the regulating services for air and water cycling. Option value is another one that relates to the possible future use of goods and services. So that captures the idea of sustainability and providing for future generations to benefit from ecosystem services. Bequest value is a related idea, but it relates to the future generations and includes all the supporting services here. And then finally, existence value are things that exist, but we do not directly use those, but nonetheless still have value. Think, for example, of a Florida panther. I've never seen one in the wild, but I know it exists, and it still has value to me. And that's I donate money to environmental organizations to help protect that creature. So these are all various types of values recognized by economists. Some of them are marketed and some are non-marketed. I apologize, this is kind of a busy chart here, but it's a breakdown of the characteristics of various kinds of resources in terms that are used by environmental economists. You see here the various types of resources: fossil fuels, minerals, water, land, solar energy, other types of renewable energy, and then ecosystem services generally. These can be classified into different types. A stock flow resource you can think of as something that is stored somewhere in the environment. It's like in a big water tank. And it has a limited capacity, and when you drain water off of that, there's less of it left there to use in the future. So fossil fuels is a classic example of that. There's only so much of crude oil reserves on planet Earth, and the more that we pump out of the ground, that's the less there is left available to use in the future, or at least in the near term. Crude oil is formed slowly over time. On the other hand, a fund service type of resource is something that just continuously flows, regardless of whether we use it or not. And so solar energy is a perfect example. The sun is shining down on the Earth's surface 24 hours a day, whether we use it or not, whether we capture that or not. And then you can also look at whether there's competitive use, or what economists call a rival good. So, for example, if the U.S. pumps oil out of the ground, that's less of it available for other countries of the world to use, and vice versa. Whereas solar energy there's no competitive use. It doesn't matter if I put up a solar panel on my house. That doesn't diminish the availability of that resource to anybody else, unless I'm maybe perhaps in a big city, if your solar panel is shading another building, but that would be a rare exception. But for ecosystem services in general, things like water and nutrient cycling and air, those would be a fund service type of resource and generally not a competitive. And in terms of substitutability, there is generally no substitute for those things. We cannot live without those services. So there have been a variety of approaches developed to value economic ecosystem services. It's become because it's important to know what these values are for having informed and rational policy and decision making. The product yield and market pricing approach is perhaps the most well-known and most well-developed, where you just, and this applies for services that are well documented and can be easily measured. For example, timber production. We know how much timber can be produced on a given size of land and what the markets are for those. We can accurately price and value that resource. Productivity and embodied energy is another one that was really pioneered by the late Howard P. Odom, who was a professor of ecology at University of Florida for many years, and I was actually privileged to take one of his courses. He came up with the idea of reducing all natural processes to common terms in common terms such as solar energy that could be give equivalent values to different stages of ecosystem processes. And his approach became known as the emergy analysis, or embodied energy approach. And I'm going to actually show you an example of that in a minute. The damage replacement or mitigation cost is another one. For example, what's the value of a wetland for treating nutrient runoff? Well, one way to look at that is how much would it cost me to build a wastewater treatment plant that would provide equivalent services for that? So that's a good approach where you have a good example of an engineered system that could produce an equivalent service. But there aren't many things where that really fits very well. The travel cost method is one that's been used a lot in recreational studies. You do surveys of people visiting natural recreation sites. You ask them how far they came and how much they spent to get there, and that becomes a pretty good measure of their value for that resource. In general, the farther people travel to experience recreation, the more they spend and the higher the value they hold for it. Hedonic pricing is one that's used often in real estate studies. You can look at comparable values of, for example, homes that have waterfront property versus otherwise similar homes that don't have that amenity, and based on that difference, you can infer the value of that waterfront resource. Contingent valuation is another one that's commonly used, usually in survey research, where you create some hypothetical scenarios or do choice experiments. You ask people how much you would be willing to pay for this situation versus that. We've done studies like that on the Everglades restoration, And based on the differences in how they value those different scenarios with some price variable built into it, and sometimes that could be a tax scenario, you can infer what their willingness to pay or consumer surplus is. And then finally, benefit transfer is sort of the backup approach, if you will, for when none of those other approaches fits very well. You can look at studies on a similar resource that have been done somewhere else, and you transfer those benefits to your situation and make adjustments for things like population size or income levels or something. So those are some commonly used approaches. I want to now just give you an example of one well-known study that was done some years ago by Robert Costanza and his colleagues at University of Maryland, then at University of Vermont. And by the way, Robert Costanza was a student of Howard Odum here at University of Florida. He was really one of the first ones to come up with a global estimate of the value of ecosystem services. And you see here the map of the world map, color-coded with the red areas here in the tropics and coastal areas highlighted as being of very high value. These are US dollars per hectare per year. So you could see in some areas are in excess of $10,000 per hectare per year. Naturally, it's the tropical, very high values associated with tropical forests here and nearshore marine ecosystems. Low values, obviously, for deserts and ice fields. So this study was quite comprehensive. It captured the full range of ecosystem services, climate regulation, water cycling, erosion control, soil formation, wastewater treatment, pollination by insects and birds, food production, raw materials, so economic activity there, genetic resources, recreation, cultural values, and so forth. So this was a study that got a lot of attention back in the day. The numbers are getting a bit dated now. Probably these values would be, some of these values may be significantly higher just because of inflation. Some may be lower because of degradation of the natural resource. So this table just is a summary of the values from that study for the different ecosystem types. You can see the values range from under $1,000 per hectare per year up to over close approaching $15,000 for wetlands, and also very high values in total for marine ecosystems, just because there is so much of that. The oceans cover 80% of the planet's surface. But very high values for wetlands because water bodies tend to have very high biological activity. But the overall value is around $800 per hectare per year. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. So there have been some attempts to develop environmental accounting systems to better integrate ecosystem service values into national accounting. I have to say those have not really developed very far. It's been most well developed in the European Union, which seems to have more recognition of environmental values. Not so much in the United States, unfortunately. But This is a rather new area that it attempts to acknowledge the value of natural resources in accounting systems, to add to just the strictly monetary market activity that's captured by GDP. Some of the basic concepts here, there's stocks and flows. Remember, I talked about a stock flow type of resource to account for things like depletion of natural resources like fossil fuels or water. And then recognizing, products and services, ecosystem inputs, non-produced assets, things that, assets that are used in the economy but are not produced by the market, and then also taking into account residuals or pollutants, because these have the potential to degrade the quality of the environment and the productivity of our resources. There's lots of issues around this. Economists argue endlessly about exactly which prices are appropriate to apply and how we can separate resources like land and timber. What happens if should we reclassify things if there's a dramatic change in quality or function of the resource. So these are all technical issues that have in part impeded the adoption of this in national accounting systems. So I want to switch now to talk a little bit about recreation, which is one of the ecosystem services or supporting services that has been pretty well documented. These are an example of different outdoor recreational activities that have been documented in a study published back in around 2000. And I think it's interesting to see the differences across different types of activities. They range from around $20 up to over $100 per recreation day. And this is in year $2,000, so you could probably double those numbers in current dollars. The overall average is a little over $50 per day, but you have some examples here like saltwater fishing that go up approaching $110 per day. So these are the net economic values, or in other words, the consumer surplus in economist jargon. It's the amount what people would be willing to pay above what their actual cost is to engage in these activities. So, in other words, it's additional money that people hold as a value for these different types of recreation. Some of the other ones here, like consumptive recreational activities like hunting or fishing, tend to be quite high, whereas passive activities like canoeing, camping, swimming, picnicking tend to be somewhat lower. To give you a better example of recreation, this is a case study of an economic study we did here at UF a few years ago, looking at the freshwater springs in north central Florida. As you probably know, we're blessed with one of the highest concentrations of springs in the world here. Bob, you know this well with the Springs Institute. It's really a unique resource in the world, and it's one of the crown jewels of Florida. But until this time, we really didn't have a very good idea of what the economic value was associated with these springs. This was a study we did looking at 10 different public springs that are the mapped here on this figure here along the Suwannee River and the Santa Fe River that spans across 4 counties in our area. So 10 public springs, all of them are state parks, state or county parks, and then 5 private springs that are open to the public for recreation. So this is some of the data we looked at. The attendance at those, the state park keeps good records on numbers of visitors and where they come from, and what types of activities they engage in. And then we use data from the Visit Florida, our official Florida tourism agency, on average visitor spending, both visitors to the state of Florida and local residents. We looked at entry fees, spending for by divers, which turns out to be a quite significant activity, which has a very high value associated with it. Cave divers come here from all over the world and spend a lot of money to engage in this very unique activity. And we also got data from some of the canoe and kayak outfitters on the Santa Fe and Ichetucknee rivers. So these are our estimates of total spending in that year, over at $84 million for these different types of activities. And we model these different activities in an regional economic model called IMPLAN that allows us to estimate the indirect economic activity that's supported by these different industries. So these are our results in terms of jobs, number of jobs supported, the total output or business revenue, the value added or equivalent to GDP, and then labor income or employee compensation and proprietor earnings. So for all, and this is arrayed with the for the different springs, both public and private. You see some of the bigger numbers here. Ginny Springs, over 285 jobs supported and over $22 million in output impact. Manatee Springs and Fanning Springs State Park, Ichetucknee Springs State Park, all also quite significant there. Over $10 million of activity. But in total, for the 15 sites we looked at, over 1,000 jobs, $94 million output, and $52 million in value added or GDP. So these are a significant economic activity in our region, no question about it. And I think these numbers surprised a lot of people and brought new attention to the importance of policies for protecting these resources. Probably these numbers would be, if these were from 2012, I would guess the numbers are probably double that in current dollars. But some of the, as you may also know, the water quality in our springs has unfortunately deteriorated, and they simply aren't as attractive as they used to be. So attendance at some of these sites, like Hart Springs, Fanning Springs, have significantly declined in recent years, unfortunately. So as somebody said before we started the lecture today, although I love Bob's idea of free ecosystem services, these resources are not truly free. They do require investment and protection. Just as a side note, again, cave diving is one particular very high valued activity associated with springs. This was a study done by Bill Huth out at University of West Florida, who is himself an avid cave diver. He looked at the data in more detail and came up with a value of $166 per person trip at a particular spring in Jackson County. This was not one in our study. Personally, I think it's crazy that people go diving in springs, but some people seem to really enjoy it. I saw a video last night of somebody traversing the Ichetucknee Trace from a sinkhole up near Lake City that goes about 10 miles underground down to and emerges at Ichetucknee Springs State Park. And the whole trip takes about 5 hours. Just being underground, trapped in that cave for that long, kind of gives me the willies. Several tanks trailing along behind them. Yeah. This is another study done by my former colleague, Janaki Alavalapati, who's now at University of Virginia, looking at willingness to pay for springs recreation in the Ocala National Forest area, Silver Glen Spring, Juniper Springs, Salt Springs, looking at different types of activities. They came up with an average daily visitor spending or per trip spending rather, of a little over $11, and ranging up to as high as $15. And for extended visitor trips, there are people camping, staying overnight, this range of values here. So it's and again, these are the net values, their willingness to pay or consumer surplus, the additional value above what people actually spend to engage in these activities. This is the picture of the I think it's a July 4th weekend at Silver Glen Springs, which is just a total mob scene. Hundreds of boaters there, really enjoying themselves a little too much, but it just shows you the attractiveness of that resource, but I think, in my opinion, probably an unsustainable use. So, just to conclude then, to give you emphasize a couple of the take-home messages here. The emergence of ecological or environmental economics as a serious academic discipline recognizes that there are non-marketed goods out there that contribute to our economy as a consumer or producer surplus. And in some cases, those services may actually exceed the market value. We have made some attempts to develop national accounting systems that would take into account ecosystem service values in the national accounts, but I think we have really a long way to go before those are truly are really used in a significant way in policy making. Recreation is one particular form of activity that's has been well documented. I think probably the best information we have about ecosystem services is in terms of recreational use. And then we have some contingent valuation studies that have provided estimates for open space protection, various types of resources. So I'll stop right there, but I think we still have some time for questions.
So you've had a whole course in resource economics. Some questions?
Hi, thank you.
Bet.
So you mentioned that the water quality and the degradation, and it's probably more of a theoretical question. I'm interested in the approach you would take if you would try to estimate these values were the resource really healthy. I don't know how you'd get it trying to estimate that, but clearly if the springs were in better shape, all those numbers would probably be higher. Is there any way to conceptualize that?
Yeah, it's a tough question. It's, you know, what economists would call a counterfactual. It's not what we have now, but what would it be like? You know, historical information is one way to look at it. What is trends, change in visitation over time in relation to changes in water quality? We could, if you could document a relationship between the change in number of visitors in relation to a specific measure like nitrate levels or water clarity or phytoplankton levels, you could maybe project backwards what our overall visitation would be under ideal conditions. Or looking, you know, do comparative study, looking at levels and changes in visitation across springs that have varying levels of water quality degradation. So, for example, Gilchrist Blue Springs is one of the springs, now a state park, previously was a private spring. It's one of the springs that has maintained pretty good water quality because it has a very healthy population of herbivores, turtles, and other things. So this is research that Matt Cohen at University of Florida has documented. You could compare that to some of the other springs that have rapidly deteriorated, like Fanning Springs. So that would be, I guess, my suggestion of how you would approach that, to see to get an idea of what the potential could be if we had a policy we're able to successfully restore the springs. Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, I guess my comment refers back to the table that you had where you had different types of areas and their values. I was surprised that you had something like $14,000 per hectare for wetlands. And then also I think lakes and rivers was something like $10,000. So those values are much higher than, for example, if we were compared with, say, high quality cropland. I'm sort of interested in how you get to that vast differences between types of land.
And the difference between land and water. I mean,
Land,
so
yeah,
yeah,
land and water, but also wetlands as opposed to, I guess we could say dry lands, which you know, in some cases are very productive in terms of their economic, I guess, of the production that comes off of it.
yeah.
You know, perhaps I'm missing something about sort of the non-production values of resources.
No, I think you got it. You got the point there. The key finding there was that wetlands and other shallow water bodies, near shore, marine environments also, are so highly productive because, um, partly because of the water. The water resource is there, is not a limiting factor for the organisms. And also partly because you've got a three-dimensional ecosystem there. The entire depth of that water column is supporting more life forms in it. But as to, the difference with various types of land and cropland versus timberland, for instance, those are relating mainly to the biodiversity of the environment there. In natural ecosystems like forests, you just have a much larger number of species there, a bigger mix of species, and more interactions between them and the land and water resource. So, yeah, it's a big, quite dramatic differences you saw there in the different types of environments. So, it's I think the take-home message for me is that we need to be recognize these differences and be prepared to protect those really high-value resources. Yes, Phyllis?
Where to start? Uh, I- this isn't really a question, it's a statement. Um, I note that the legislature is unwilling to more strictly regulate the use of septic tanks, which are the source of much of the degradation of our springs. What does it take to inform the legislators of the economic value of these springs versus the cost of individual homeowners better managing their septic tanks, or alternatively, building wastewater treatment plants and properly managing that effluent? I used to swim in Poe Springs back around 1991. Oh my God, I don't even want to look at it now. About 1996, I was in Tallahassee giving a briefing on the putative value of water to the House Natural Resources Committee. I was interrupted by a woman from South Florida on the committee who yelled out, "Why are we paying taxes on Florida anyway?" She thought the fact that she was paying a water bill meant it was a tax. There was so little understanding of resource management. Anyway, I'm just totally frustrated. So some of this information that you presented to us, even though it's dated, is of such high value. How is that communicated to the legislators?
Yeah, great question. I share your frustration. It's with great difficulty is the basic answer. It's not a message that a lot of political leaders want to hear, unfortunately. The thing that I've tried to do in my career is to to make the case for environmental resource protection in terms of the economic activity that they do support, jobs and income. And so in my role as a regional economist, using these models to estimate the indirect values of economic activity, I found that does resonate quite strongly with political leaders. They do pay attention to things like jobs and income. And if you can make the case then that some of those, where those things are dependent upon healthy ecosystems, I think there is a chance that you can get political support for those. Unfortunately, the springs is something the Springs Protection Act a few years ago, I think it was $50 million appropriated, really has done nothing to help the springs. They've continued to degrade. The enforcement is practically non-existent. There's been no move to better regulate septic tanks or limit agricultural fertilizer application. I mean, in these spring protection areas, there should be an outright ban on fertilizer, period. Even if that means putting some farmers out of business. Yeah, I think that, in terms of the political reality is you have to make the case for these things in terms of things that are meaningful to politicians and their constituents, and jobs and income is one of those.
The another issue, DER, as it existed in the 70s and 80s, became aware that the dairy farm proliferation north of Lake Okeechobee was, of course, damaging the lake. So the state actually allocated money to buy out the dairies.
Yes.
So the dairymen took their cows and established their dairies in the Suwannee River basin. So it's not just corn farmers over fertilizing their fields. It's also dairies that are now damaging the quality of the water.
Yes, absolutely. It is. I mean, the studies prove that tracing nutrients. They have technology now to tag the genetic-like markers on some of these nutrients, and they can actually document the flow from dairy farms into Ichetucknee Springs. So yes, it's all types of agriculture really need to be extra sensitive in this environment, this karst environment, very porous limestone areas. Really, anything that you dump on the ground is going to end up in those springs. We know that. This is not hypothetical. We absolutely know this. So it's just a matter of bringing awareness in the public to this issue and putting pressure on political leaders to come up with solutions.
And certainly one of the questions is who does that? I'll mention a case, Alan, and then you might like to comment on. I worked on seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon, and it declined in 2017. We know that the problem is excess nutrients. The biggest call for action actually came from local chambers of commerce, because people weren't coming there to fish, and they weren't, recreation was down. So they felt it, but I don't know how you sell it on a statewide or larger scale. I mean, we estimated that seagrass beds are maybe $20,000 or $30,000 per acre. So that's maybe $60,000-$70,000 per hectare.
Wow.
A big number. So it came out to $1 billion a year, and it seems like the argument needs to be made that it might cost, I don't know, a couple or $5 billion to clean up the system, but if you get $1 billion in return, that's a big return on investment. And do economists try to sell this, or who carries it on?
Normally economists aren't making that pitch. We try to maintain some impartiality and let environmental advocates make that sell that to the politicians. But yeah, it's a matter of putting it in concrete terms that political leaders can understand. And they when they hear enough people complaining about changes, adverse changes, then they start to listen. And also, it helps if you find there are some enlightened legislators, believe it or not, and they're known as champions in the environmental community. You find a couple of those, and they can provide the leadership for their others, the political cover for their other legislative colleagues to begin to think that this is a reasonable idea. I know this is what happened, for example, with is happening now with the whole issue of the Ocklawaha River restoration. We've identified a couple of champions in the legislature who are willing to sponsor bills and to argue for this on behalf of this to their legislative colleagues. And then it becomes a matter for them personally in the legislature. They begin to believe that this is not a crazy idea. This is something their legislative colleagues have come up with. And it looks like now, maybe for the first time in 50 years, we might have some funding available for Ocklawaha River restoration.
And the economic background and the study for that was done by Alan. Yeah.
My group, my little consulting group, was part of an economic valuation of the Indian River Lagoon back in 1995. And we were hoping that those reports would influence the county governments to take action to better control their effluent or air agricultural runoff, point or non-point. I don't know to what extent that actually ever infiltrated into the county commissioners' thinking. It was almost $1 billion a year in primary economic impacts. And then there was another project done again. It was, what, $5 billion a year economic benefit? But yet it still is deteriorating. So I think part of the problem is term limits. It takes a lot of time for a movement to get going, and then the primary movers are termed out and they're gone.
Yeah, sometimes county commissions can be the worst, really. They're reflective of these communities, many of which are still very conservative and some very low income and low education levels. So it just takes time, but I'm hopeful that eventually these backward communities will come around.
And Phyllis, there is a case for that, and I attribute to Virginia Barker, who's the environmental person for Brevard County, and the county has instituted, I don't know whether it's a half penny or a penny tax that goes to converting septic tanks to sewer treatment plants. So bits and pieces. Thank you for the big picture, Alan. That's wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.